Hey there, everybody. Welcome back to Putting the Story in History. And today our topic is sad and heavy, but an important one to discuss anyway. Today we're going to talk about the Armenian Genocide, which means quite a bit to me because I'm actually Armenian, and it directly affected my family. If you remember watching one of the first episodes of this series, I talked about how my father's family escaped the Armenian Genocide, only to be embroiled in World War II and all of that craziness. So it did have a direct effect on me personally, and so it's something I want to talk about. First of all, what was happening when this genocide took place? Well, for one, the Armenian Genocide took place during World War One, so from 1914 to 1917, and it occurred within the borders of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire had been around for a very long time at this point, basically since the 1400s. So this is a 500-year long empire, and at this point, the Ottoman Empire had really shrunk. It was much smaller than it had originally been. It had been struggling financially, militarily, politically. It was just not doing very well. We were kind of at the cusp, the end of empires at this point in history, right at the beginning of the 1900s. And so the big issue that was facing them then was in World War I, they were dragged into this conflict due to the series of alliances that had kind of kept Europe stable for that long. And so now they found themselves fighting France and England and Russia. Now, France and England weren't necessarily that big of a deal to them at the beginning of the war, right? They weren't very close. They were fighting in Germany. England did end up eventually sending troops to try to defeat the Ottomans in other places. But at the very pressing moment, at the beginning of the war, was the fact that Russia was on their border, and they now had to fight Russia, right? So they're worried about that. To give a little bit more backstory, right? Russia and the Ottoman Empire had this border. At the time, the Ottoman Empire controlled what you'd think of as like the Stan countries, so like Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, all those countries up there, as well as parts of Armenia. Or modern-day Armenia. So they controlled those areas, whereas Russia just had kind of the regular Russian area at that point. They didn't have all those extra territories that they would eventually pick up at the USSR. So they had a direct border, and the Ottomans were worried because of the Armenians, who were kind of split between the two countries. So there's a large group of Armenians that lived in Russia, and there's a large group of Armenians that live within the borders of the Ottoman Empire. And the leaders of the Ottoman Empire didn't really trust the Armenians, one, because they followed a different religion. They were Christian, and the Ottoman Empire was mostly Muslim. But also, the Armenians had risen to a special place kind of in the Ottoman Empire. They were mostly well educated. They weren't all wealthy, but they held positions in the Ottoman Empire that allowed them to acquire wealth in ways that some people that were Muslim Ottomans could not. And so they were kind of this not necessarily powerful, but definitely strong minority group in the Ottoman Empire, and they were also very nationally conscious. They knew they were Armenians. They knew they were living in an empire that was not, their sovereign nationality. And this was at a time when nationalism was on the rise. So the Ottomans were worried that the Armenians would seize this opportunity to try to team up with Russia and potentially get their own cut of the Ottoman Empire territory, basically get like an Armenian state, like sponsored by Russia, out of this. So they were worried about that. So as the war began and kind of dragged on, and the war with Russia wasn't particularly going great for the Ottoman Empire, they decided to kind of start to scapegoat the Armenians as the cause of the downfall of the Ottoman army. The reason the Ottomans weren't winning, obviously, was because the Armenians were somehow involved and somehow ruining it. And so the message from the national government was basically that Armenians aren't like us, they're different, and they're helping out our enemies on the border. Which, not sure if that was actually true or not. It might have been. There were probably some Armenians that were helping Russia, and there were probably some Armenians on the Russian side helping the Ottomans. You don't actually know, right, the details of all of that. But what we do know is that the Ottomans had that fear. That was what they were afraid of. And so they started projecting that to their people, and eventually they ended up deciding that having Armenians on the border with an enemy like Russia was just not an acceptable thing to have happen. So what they did is they rounded up as many of the Armenians as they could. They found as many as possible, right? And they decided to march them to Syria, where they would relocate them. Now, here's where things get fishy, okay? There is no record that says that the intentions of the Ottomans was to murder all of the Armenians. Not that I've been able to find. I'm sure there might be something out there. We're not sure. Okay? The historical record on this is incredibly fuzzy. One, because the Turkish government has been burning their records, so we don't actually know, which is kind of very guilty if you ask me. But then also, the people who have been able to go see these records are usually people from Turkey. They don't actually they don't let foreigners in to read these historical records before they're burning them. Only people who are going to defend Turkey in this instance have been allowed to read these documents. The other part is the people who are on the other side of this, who are not Turkish, who are mostly Armenian, who are writing about this, are pretty biased, right? So there's kind of this kind of upheaval in the historical narrative of this genocide. Both sides are incredibly biased, and they're not really writing objective history. What we do know is that the Ottomans rounded up these Armenians and began to march them to Syria. Now, what was the issue with that? Well, one, when they were taking them to this place in Syria, they didn't really have anything set up for them. They were just marching them into a desert. Okay? So, not great. Two, they were being escorted by the military. So the military was the ones who were escorting these civilians, basically, to the desert, where there was no necessarily place for them to go. And then also, the Ottoman Empire at this point was so economically strained, they didn't even have enough food to feed their civilians in general, or their army. So the fact that they were marching, millions of people down into this desert wasn't really going well. They did not have the supply chain, nor did they have the food reserves to actually feed these people. So all these people are marching, they're hungry, they don't have any food, they're basically under arrest by their government, and they're being marched into a desert, away from their homeland. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of Armenians died on this forced march, and more died when they actually got to the camps. There have been reports that the army was killing people on the way. They weren't very, nice about that. All these other things. Okay, so clearly, right, there was a mass murder, right? All these Armenians died at the hands of the Turkish military, whether it was intentional or not. Regardless, right, that would be considered a genocide, right? It's a mass extinction of a certain type of people. They were intentionally or not murdering all these people who are all Armenian. So doesn't look great for Turkey in that regards. Like I've said, recently it's become very controversial whether or not you support the fact that this is a genocide or not, right? France in the 2010s passed a law that said that it was real, and that if you say that it's not real, then we can arrest you and put you in jail. A pretty harsh law, I'd say. I think it's a little much. And on the other side, you have Turkey, who's outright denying the fact that it was a genocide. And of course they are, because they're a new government. They're no longer the Ottoman Empire, and they want to move past it. They don't want to have to deal with the consequences of what these other people who used to run their country did, which I also understand. It's not something that any country really wants to have thrown on them. It's kind of bad publicity, as well as the potential political, economic repercussions of it. So, it kind of in summary, right? The Armenian Genocide, there was death, there was killing, right? People died on this march to Syria. And they were all Armenian, right? Was it intentional? We're never going to truly know. We don't have the records to actually know. And the records, if they do exist, are being destroyed by the Turkish government. So we're never going to find out, okay, exactly what happened. And that's part of history. That's how history works. We don't always get to know all the answers. Now, am I saying that there is no Armenian genocide? Absolutely not. I 100% believe that this was a genocide. Now, do we have the historical evidence to really point to that? Not really sure. But I do know that the scale and the destruction of the Armenian people in this incident was catastrophic and terrible. And it was really kind of the first documented, or not documented, but it's definitely the first genocide that the UN has in the timeline, right, of the world. It's the first genocide that the UN has recognized as a genocide. So it was terrible. It was. There's not much else you can say about it. It was not a good thing. So thank you so much for watching. Thank you so much for being open to the idea, right, potentially that history is not as cut and dry as it sounds, right? It can get messy. Political biases and just personal biases of historians can interfere the historical record. National governments can hide information and make it harder to know the truth. And so it's never as clean and cut and dry as it's presented in a history class. And that's something that I think a lot of people don't really truly understand about history, is that it's not all set in stone. How we view and interpret history changes based on the new evidence that we get and the new interpretations we get by growing and progressing as a civilization. Anyways, thank you for watching Putting a Story in History. Next time we'll talk about something new, maybe something a little bit happier. We'll find out. Have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye.